Okay, is everybody ready? Okay, so we start with the homage to the Buddha. Let me turn this on. Okay, so today is Sunday, September 3rd, 2017, and this is the first session in the morning, 9 a.m. Okay, so we'll start with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Okay, so before we go further in our exploration of the aggregate of consciousness, let's just take a quick overview of what we covered yesterday. Okay, so following the Visuddhimagga method, a little different from the sequence in the comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma. Okay, so we did the sense sphere, the 8 sense sphere, wholesome types of consciousness, the 5 material sphere, fine material sphere, wholesome types of consciousness, that is the consciousness of the 5 fine material sphere jhanas. So we covered that. We covered the 4 immaterial sphere, wholesome states of consciousness. That is the states of consciousness that constitute the 4 immaterial meditative attainments. And we covered the 4 supramundane wholesome chittas, that is the 4 kinds of path consciousness. The type of consciousness that eradicates defilements and eventually culminates in liberation from samsara. Then we also covered the 12 types of unwholesome chittas, 8 rooted in greed, 2 rooted in hatred or maybe say aversion, and 2 rooted exclusively in delusion without a mixture of greed and hatred. So we covered these 12. Then we covered the 8 kinds of wholesome resultant, the 7 kinds of unwholesome resultant, the rootless resultants, and we covered the 8 sense sphere resultant, the 8 beautiful sense sphere resultant types of consciousness. So that takes us now, we're about to come to the fine material sphere resultants, and then the immaterial sphere resultants. So let us go back to our basic text, the Visuddhimagga. Okay, so we had resultant consciousness in all the 4 planes. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm jumping the gun. Okay, so we ended with the sense sphere resultant consciousness, which is of 23 kinds. Okay, now we come to the fine material sphere resultant consciousness, and this is of 5 kinds. So the 5 kinds of fine material sphere resultant consciousness are just mirror images of the 5 types of wholesome consciousness. So it's the jhana consciousness, according to the 5 levels of jhana, that produce as their results, each one produces as its respective result, a resultant consciousness that corresponds exactly to itself. So we can see this. From this table, so you see we have the 5 jhanas, and these, if they are attained as jhanic attainments, then they are wholesome types of consciousness. And then when each of these wholesome consciousnesses, when it produces its result, it produces a result which is just the mirror image of itself. It corresponds exactly to itself. The difference is in the function. So the wholesome fine material sphere consciousness occurs through the meditative attainment of the jhana. But the resultant consciousness occurs in the fine material sphere realm of existence, in the role of the rebirth consciousness at the moment of rebirth, and then it continues as the bhavanga through the course of the consciousness until the moment of death when it terminates. So in the fine material realm of existence, this is beyond the sense sphere realm, the base level consciousness of the beings. You see, the fine material realm of existence is divided into 5 broad levels which correspond to the 5 jhanic attainments. Or actually it's divided into 4 levels corresponding to the 4 jhanas of the sutta scheme. But in those fine material realms of existence, in each stratum, each of the 4 stratum, the base consciousness is a consciousness that corresponds to one of the 5 jhanic levels. So if a meditator attains the first jhana as a human being and masters that jhana, then at the time of death, if that consciousness takes on the role of generating rebirth, it will produce rebirth in the fine material realm in the particular plane corresponding to the first jhana. And that first jhana consciousness, so a fine material sphere consciousness, when it takes on the role of resultant, then it functions as the rebirth consciousness, and then it will function as the bhavanga through the whole course of life of those beings in the first jhanic plane of existence, up to the moment of death. And similarly, with the second jhana, there's actually a complication because of the Abhidhammic scheme of 2 kinds of the second and third jhana. Okay, then with the third jhanic plane, that will be the result of the 4th jhana of the Abhidhamma system. And then the 4th jhanic plane, the rebirth consciousness there, will be the wholesome 5th jhanic chitta of the Abhidhammic system. And so the important point to understand is that these 5 kinds of jhana consciousness, when they produce their results, those results will be the base level consciousness in the fine material realm of existence. That consciousness will generate the rebirth, and then after the rebirth consciousness, through the whole course of the life, it will be the deep underlying bhavanga consciousness. Okay, the same thing applies to the immaterial sphere. So in this case, we have 4 immaterial wholesome types of consciousness, and that is the consciousness of the 4 immaterial meditative attainments: the base of infinite space, base of infinite consciousness, base of nothingness, base of neither perception nor non-perception. And so we have, say, a yogi who, let us say, masters the base of infinite space as a human being. And so when death takes place, that consciousness, it's the karma generated by that consciousness, will generate rebirth into the immaterial sphere of existence, and it will produce a rebirth specifically in the base of infinite space in the immaterial realm. And then the consciousness that occurs at the moment of rebirth linking, that is the result, the karmic result of the attainment of boundless space as a human being. And so that consciousness, that resultant consciousness, serves at the moment of rebirth as the rebirth consciousness, and then after that it becomes the base level consciousness through the whole course of that existence. So whenever there isn't an active state process of consciousness taking place, when the stream of consciousness drops down to the base level, it drops down to the bhavanga, and that bhavanga will be the result of, in this case, the first immaterial sphere attainment, that is the sphere or the base of boundless space. And similarly with the base of boundless consciousness, base of nothingness, base of neither perception nor non-perception. So you could see this here. So here we have the 4 immaterial attainments. So these are the wholesome chittas, the chittas of the actual, that occur in the actual meditative attainments. And then these are their results, which correspond exactly to them. Except what differs is the function. In the case of the jhanas, the 5 jhanas, and the immaterial attainments, in the process of consciousness, those chittas occur in the role of javana, if you remember. Whereas the resultant consciousnesses occur not in the process of consciousness, in the active process, but they occur in the roles of rebirth linking, then the bhavanga or life continuum, and then they sign off at the moment of death. Okay, so let us go back now. Okay, so now we've covered the fine material sphere, immaterial sphere resultants. Now we come to the supramundane resultants. And what are these supramundane resultants? These are the fruitions of, the text says, these are the fruitions of the consciousness associated with the four paths. So each path consciousness, that is the wholesome supramundane consciousness, occurs only as one mind moment, just in the snap of a finger that occurs. But that supramundane path consciousness produces a corresponding fruition consciousness. So we have the path of stream entry, and then the result of that is called the fruit of stream entry. And that fruit of stream entry in the Abhidhamma system is a particular type of consciousness that corresponds to the path. And so we have the fruit of stream entry, fruit of once returning, fruit of non-returning, and then the fruit of arahatship, the final fruit. Now the fruition consciousness can occur in two ways. This is a rather technical point. Okay, first, in the actual cognitive process in which the path arises. The path arises, as I said, just one mind moment like that, just a split-second breakthrough to the unconditioned. And then following that, there will occur 2 or 3 mind moments that are called the fruition consciousness. And the fruition consciousness experiences that bliss of Nibbana that has been made accessible through the attainment of the path. I compare in this case the relationship between path and fruit, just to use a kind of concrete worldly illustration. It's a little bit like a prisoner who's has his arms bound with shackles. And then somehow, when the guards aren't looking, he uses a file to start filing away at the metal of those bonds. So those filing away of the metal with the file, that would be like the development, the unfolding of insight knowledge. And then at a certain point, when insight knowledge comes to full maturity, then there comes that one moment breakthrough of the path. That is like the prisoner realizing that there's just a tiny bit of metal holding his bonds in place. So he exerts all of his strength and he breaks the bond. So that is like the path. And then there comes a moment where he experiences, when the bond is broken, a kind of shoo, wow, gone, the bond is gone. That kind of bliss arises. That is like the fruition consciousness that comes immediately after the path. But the fruition consciousness, once one attains a particular path and fruit, it's said that one could also experience the fruition at a later time as a particular kind of meditative attainment. So in this case, say the meditator has reached the path and fruit of stream entry. So he's now a stream enterer. And so this meditator wants to experience the bliss of Nibbana. So he'll make the determination, let me enter the fruition attainment of stream entry, and then sit down, and then the mind will go through preparatory stages, and then it will enter into the fruition of stream entry. And the meditator will be able to sit perhaps like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, maybe even several hours, experiencing the bliss of Nibbana. taking Nibbana as the direct object of experience. So that is the fruition attainment. And both of these are this is the resultant type of consciousness, and that consciousness is the direct result of that corresponding path attainment. So each path has its own fruit, and each path has its corresponding fruition attainment. And then the highest of these, of course, is the fruition attainment of arhatship. This is called the arahata pala samapatti. Many years ago, I had a friend who had on his car, he had, what do you call the things that people paste on their car? Bumper stickers. It said, Arahata Palachita or bust. Then I think it might have said, hunk if you agree. Okay, so now at this point we've covered all the kinds of resultant consciousness of the 4 planes. So the 36 kinds. Okay, so we have the supramundane results. Immaterial sphere results, fine material sphere results. So what remains are the functional, what are called the functional types of consciousness. And these are of 3 kinds according to plane. So we have functionals of the sense sphere, functionals of the fine material sphere, functionals of the immaterial sphere. Okay, that of the sense sphere is of 2 kinds. Okay, without any roots and those with roots. So the roots, if you remember, greed, hatred, delusion, or non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. So let's see first the ones that are without any roots, completely devoid of any roots. And then these are of 2 kinds. Okay, one is the mind element, the other is the mind consciousness element. So before getting deterred by these terms, let's see exactly what they are. Okay, the mind element, the functional mind element, we came across this yesterday. This is what is called the 5-door inverting consciousness. So let us go back to page 155. I know why. Okay. Can you see all right? Can you see in the back? If you can see, put your hand up. Okay. Okay, so after the bhavanga gets cut off, this is in the case of a sense door process through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, or body. when the bhavanga gets cut off, the first active citta that arises is the 5-door inverting consciousness. Remember, this is like the consciousness that functions as the the gatekeeper or doorkeeper. So it's listening to find out which door there's somebody knocking on, and then it goes to that door just to turn to that door. So this is a purely functional consciousness. It's not a karmic consciousness. It doesn't create any result, and it's not a resultant consciousness. It just has its sort of mechanical function to perform in the series of cittas. It's like, this is your job, you do that, and it performs its job. So it's said that this has the characteristic of being the forerunner of eye consciousness. You could see it precedes eye consciousness, or ear, nose, tongue, body consciousness. And its function is to advert. It turns to whatever object has appeared, and it will take that object as its own object. If it's a visible form appearing at the eye door, it turns to that form. If it's a sound at the ear door, it turns to that sound, and so on. Okay, then comes the mind consciousness element. I have to figure this out. Okay, now I see what this is. Okay, so this consciousness is called the mind consciousness element. And this one that is shared by all is the functional mind conscious element accompanied by equanimity without root cause. It has the characteristic of cognizing the 6 kinds of objects. Now this is the important point that I've marked here. Its function is to determine at the 5 doors and to advert at the mind door. The entry was supposed to be closed off, so visitors are not supposed to be coming into this hall now. We need a 5-door adverting consciousness. Okay, so coming back. Okay, its function is to determine at the 5 doors and to advert at the mind door. Okay, now you see, one consciousness can perform several functions. It's not confined to one function. So in a sense door process of consciousness, or process of cittas, this consciousness has the function of determining. That is, its function is to determine what is the object that has appeared at the sense door. It determines the nature of that object. And that paves the way for the occurrence of the javana. So that is called, in this role, that consciousness is called the determining consciousness. And it follows the series of eye consciousness, receiving, and investigation. But this same type of consciousness, it's the same in terms of its constitution, plays another role or exercises another function in the mind door series, when the process of consciousness is not being based on the physical sense door, but is occurring purely internally in the mind door. In that particular process, it is called the mind door adverting consciousness. and we see it. I'm all mixed up. Okay. Okay, we could see that the place of that consciousness here. So in this case, the series, the citta viti, the cognitive process, is taking an internal object, not an external immediate sense object. And so first there occur the 3 moments of bhavanga, the flowing bhavanga, the vibration, then the stopping of the series. Then after that, the first citta to arise is the mind door adverting consciousness. And that is followed immediately by the series of jhavanas. And so the mind door adverting, its function is to turn to the object that has appeared at the mind door. And so the mind door adverting consciousness and the determining consciousness are really 2 functions of the same type of consciousness. And technically that type of consciousness is called the mind consciousness, the rootless mind consciousness element, functional consciousness, I believe. Yeah. This mind consciousness element, the functional mind consciousness element accompanied by equanimity without roots. That is the technical description of that type of consciousness. Usually we call it simply the determining consciousness. And we say the determining consciousness plays 2 functions. Either it determines at the sense door, or it functions as mind door adverting at the mind door. Again, I used the simile yesterday of the man who might be a lawyer. So that is his main function. So I used the professor. So the Professor Jones, so everybody calls him Professor, but also he's the husband. So to his wife, he's Dave, or David. To his students, he's Professor Jones. Okay, so this is the functional mind conscious element, and what's meant by shared by all is that it's shared by all individuals. So all individuals that have consciousness have this kind of, this state of consciousness arises. Now I see what's meant here by not shared by all. And this is one of the strangest birds within the Abhidhamma system. This is the functional mind consciousness element accompanied by joy without root cause. Okay, it has it takes the 6 kinds of objects, which is not so important. The important, the sort of defining characteristic actually is the function, and that is that it causes smiling in arahats about things that are not sublime. Please don't ask me many questions about this kind of consciousness. It's a very, very strange kind. I don't know how it got to be included in the Abhidhamma system, why it was included, but it's there, and so we just have to acknowledge it. Okay, and this consciousness, this functional consciousness, occurs at the position where it occurs is in the position of the jhavana, that it occurs in the jhavana stage, Apparently, when arahats see some ordinary object that causes them to smile, on account of which they smile, and the consciousness that is causing them to smile about that ordinary object is said to be this particular type of consciousness, which conventionally we refer to it as the arahat's smiling consciousness. Okay, so those are the sense sphere functional types of consciousness without roots, and those are said to be, those are the three kinds. The five-door inverting consciousness, the determining consciousness, which is also the mind door inverting consciousness, and the arahat's smiling consciousness. Okay, now we come to the sense sphere functional types of the sense sphere functional types of consciousness which have roots. And there are, in the sense sphere, there are 8 kinds, and these 8 kinds correspond to the 8 kinds of wholesome sense sphere consciousness. So let us look at the table. Okay, so again, these are they call them the general title is the sense sphere beautiful chittas, because they're all considered to be beautiful because they have good roots. But of these 24 types of consciousness, 8 of them are wholesome, and the wholesome types of consciousness occur in ordinary people and even in the noble ones, the noble disciples of the lower 3 stages, that is, stream enterers, once returners, and non-returners. And these types of consciousness are called wholesome because they create or generate wholesome karma. This is good karma with the potential to produce their results, the beautiful results. Now, these same types of consciousness, in terms of their general descriptions, will occur in arahats. But in the case of arahats, these types of consciousness do not create karma. So from an ordinary perspective, we would consider their kinds of consciousness to be wholesome. But in the Abhidhamma, technically, a wholesome consciousness is a consciousness that creates wholesome karma, karma with the ability to produce desirable results. But the consciousness of an arahat doesn't create any more karma. For the arahat, the production of karma is finished, exhausted, ended. So the arahat's consciousness, maybe we could compare them to like birds flying across the sky. Well, let us say first we have deer or squirrels walking across a road or a patch of dirt. So we could see in the patch of dirt the footprints of the deer. We know that's a deer. Other footprints, we know that's a squirrel. Other footprints, we know that's a dog. So these animals and human beings also walking, we see those are the footprints of a human being, an ordinary human being. But the case of the arahat, they are like birds flying across the sky. We look in the sky and we can't say, okay, sparrows have flown across here, crows have flown across, hawks have flown across, robins have flown across there, because birds don't leave any tracks in the sky. And so the arahats' actions don't create any karmic potentials. So their actions, even though when they're performing good actions, the consciousness behind them, it's a good consciousness. So we say they're beautiful chittas, but technically they're not wholesome but functional because they don't create any karma. Yeah, so here it continues. It says, I'm going to substitute, while the wholesome arises in it should be trainees. Trainees refers to the noble ones of the lower three levels. Stream enterers, once returners, non-returners. And ordinary, again the male bias here, let's say ordinary people. So the wholesome chittas arise in those who are undergoing training, the noble ones of the lower three levels, and ordinary people. But these types of chittas arise only in arhats. Okay, so this explanation makes it easy now for me to complete the explanation of the functionals here. So we have the fine material sphere and immaterial sphere functional types of consciousness are, again, 5 kinds, just like the fine material sphere wholesome, and 4 kinds, just like the immaterial sphere wholesome, except that these are the meditative attainments of arhats. So arhats will attain the 5 jhanas. They might attain the 4 immaterial attainments, but their chittas within those attainments are not creating the karma that will lead to rebirth in the fine material realm or in the immaterial realm. So their chittas are purely functional types of consciousness. Okay, so now we've covered all the types of functional consciousness, the 3 planes, the 20 kinds in all. Let's see how they stack up in our general chart. Okay, so we did the 3 rootless functionals. So those are the 5-door adverting, the determining consciousness, which is also mind door adverting, and then the arahat's smiling consciousness. Then the sense sphere functional types of consciousness, those are the 8 types of consciousness like the wholesome when they arise in arahats. So we've covered those. And then we've covered the 5 fine material sphere functional. Those are the 5 types of jhana consciousness when the arhats achieve one or another of the 5 jhanas. So those are taken care of. And then we have the 4 immaterial sphere functionals. Those are the states of consciousness that arise in arhats when they attain one or another of the immaterial sphere types of consciousness. So lo and behold, wow, we've covered the 81 mundane chittas and the 8 supramundane chittas. So we've gotten all 89 chittas at a glance. I'm not going to go into the 121, that gets rather technical. It would take too long. Okay, maybe I could ask whether well, before I ask for questions, I see that our Hillary, who has been doing the hard work of translating into Chinese hour after hour, never gets the chance to ask her questions. So she wrote them out. So let me read them first. Okay, in the 5-door and mind process, registration is a resultant consciousness. Is it a resultant from the jhana in the same process? That is jhavana the karma that leads to the registration as its resultant? Well, that's a very good question, and it shows a pretty good grasp of the technicalities of the Abhidhamma. But the answer here would be somewhat surprising. The registration, the resultant chittas that arise in the function of registration are not the results of the jhavana chittas that immediately precede them, but rather they are the results of some previous karma that somehow it gets the opportunity to ripen because of complex play of circumstances. That karma gets the opportunity to ripen, and when it ripens, it generates those two resultant chittas. Those two resultant chittas are of the same type when they occur. It's like 1, 2, no difference between them in type. It's just that there are two. In order for registration to occur, it has to occur twice, I guess, to make us an adequate impression. To me, it's a rather strange idea how karma from the past, even a past life, can take on that role of generating a registration consciousness in an active, conscious process. But that's just what the system says. Many years ago, when I was studying Chinese with a woman, now deceased, her name was, we called her Lao She Che. Sometimes I would come to I had a puzzle about a point in Chinese syntax, and I would say, how do you explain this? And she would answer, that's the way they say it in Chinese. Okay, second question. If the process only ends with registration when the object is very great. Okay, the process only ends with registration when the object is very great. So if the process does not end with registration, does that mean that such process does not create karmic result? No, not at all. As long as the process takes place and there are jhavana chittas in that process, those jhavana chittas are creating karma. Because the registration is the result of some previous karma, not the karma of the jhavana. So the new jhavanas are creating karma that will produce results in the future, either later in this life or in some future existence. Okay, third question. Okay, why is it that only the process in the sense sphere has registration? Is it because the results created by the process in the fine material and immaterial spheres and the supramundane are related, are jhana consciousness or fruition consciousness? I think it's a good question. I can't say that I know the answer offhand, but I just give a guess at an answer. I would say probably that registration only occurs in sense sphere because in the case of fine material sphere or jhana consciousness and immaterial sphere consciousness and the supramundane path and fruition consciousness, the object is already extremely clear, so there's no need for registration of the object. And so it's just that the impression of the object is so strong in those types of chittas that there's no need for registration. But in the case of sense sphere types of processes, these types of processes just, they arise and pass away. And so for the retention of the object to occur, there has to be a kind of consciousness which has that special function of registering the impression of the object. That is my guess at an explanation. Okay, please, Venerable.
So the 17-step sense-door process raises some pretty significant questions in my mind. Yeah. So first off, the delay that it creates between the actual occurrence of a sense object and then consciousness of the object. So it's stating that's as much as 5 mind moments afterwards.
Say again. So
the consciousness of a sense object, according to the Abhidhamma system, is as much as 5 mind moments after the sense object. So first, that implies that there is no such thing as direct experience. Is this correct?
I don't see why.
Because your experience of the object is 5 mind moments later. So something occurs, and then there's the one continuing bhavanga moment, then there's the vibrating bhavanga moment, then there's the arrest bhavanga moment.
Okay, now I see the point. And there's an answer to that in the Abhidhamma system. And this is that material phenomena exist, their rate of change is slower than the rate of change of conscious phenomena. So material phenomena are said to endure. It seems like a convenient explanation to fit, as though there's some deity that has arranged things to fit the cognitive process. But it's said that a material phenomena endures for 17 mind moments. So the material, say a visible form, comes into range of the eye door. And when it comes into range, there are the 3 moments of bhavanga go by. Then the 14 moments of the cognitive process go by. So those are 17 mind moments. In those 17 mind moments, that visible form object is enduring. And the visible form object ceases only with the cessation moment of the last consciousness in the series, the second registration consciousness.
Do they place a similar extended duration on mind objects?
No, because mind objects they endure through the whole process of the mind cognition. So the mind object is not outside the mind itself. And so as long as the jhavanas of the mind process are occurring, they are taking an object which is a purely internal mental object. So that there's no need to correlate the duration of the object with the duration of the states of consciousness.
So the mind then, what you're stating is that the mind then causes the mind object to persist until it's done playing with it. Is that correct?
I would just say simply that the mind consciousness takes an object internal to itself. And so there's no question about the duration of the object either stopping before the series of mind consciousnesses or enduring beyond the series of mind consciousnesses. So just to take, at a course level, let me take an example. Okay, I'm thinking of the entryway to Taishu Hall. So this is a mental image. So as long as I'm thinking of the entry to Taishu Hall, then that entry is present to my mind consciousnesses. When I stop thinking about when I stop thinking about the entryway to Taishu Hall, then the series of mind consciousnesses and their object, the entryway, the mental image of that entryway, cease simultaneously. Okay, we have Ming and Jane.
Thank you, Bendy. I have a question about the five sense door and mind-only door. And
the mind?
Mind-only process.
Okay.
Okay. So basically, five sense door is you have something happen, like somebody knocks the door and then you respond.
Yeah.
But for what reason mind process start processing?
A particular object.
And take, why it happened. For example.
Yeah, that's... Okay, why is it that the mind door process
even start? Yeah,
takes a particular object?
Yeah, because for example, and like I do meditation, I say, okay, quiet, that I don't want to bother. But, okay, nothing bother, but mind door just run.
Right, yeah.
That, I don't know for what reason that happened. And also, like, for five sense door, okay, I close my eye, then I do not processing any imaging. I close my ear, then I stop listening. But I want my mind to be quiet, but you give the process like when the mind process start, then you have jhana. But what make it start first place?
What?
What make the mind process to start up?
Yeah, it's just that it's an interesting question. It's one of those questions I think maybe not dealt with in the canonical Abhidhamma. It seems to me to be the case. We all have like these vast accumulations of past experiences, past desires, expectations, wishes, hopes for the future, and so on. So these are all things which are accumulated at deep levels of the consciousness. And so when we stop attending to things outwardly through the senses and then try to settle the mind, then these come bubbling up to the surface. They're probably like, when we have to look into whole networks of conditioning that bring up this thought rather than that thought. But I think that to my knowledge, there's no answer to that in the canonical Abhidhamma. Maybe some of the later commentaries discuss that.
That's what I feel. The Abhidhamma doesn't answer this, but on the
the
other hand, I think read through Abhidhamma, I do not see the answer. So I ask Bendy. And on the other hand, is that the phenomenon? It means I think there's something like the impermanence of the mind. If I observe the mind just pop up, whatever, it's totally auto control, and nobody control it. It's just
well, the mind can be. What we're trying to do is to bring the mind under control. That's sort of the problem that the ordinary people face, is that the mind is not under control, and most people out in the world don't make any attempt to control and to master the mind. And the task that the Buddha gives us is to control and master the mind, and that we do with the tools that the Dhamma provides us, like mindfulness, clear comprehension, different approaches to meditative development, and so forth.
Thank you.
Okay, so we take Jane, and then I think we'll have to go for a break.
I just wanted to follow up on Bhante Sudaso's question.
Yeah.
So the mind door consciousness turning inward to the mind object. So would you say that there's like co-arising between the mind door consciousness and the object?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we should note, this is maybe an important point, that the mind door process can take as its object the objects of the five senses, but in that case there won't be an immediate experience of that sense object. Like I could think of, let us say, Kaidi's car, a blue car, a very bright blue car. So I'm thinking now a mind or process is taking a visual object, but that visual object, that Kaidi's car, is not present in my field of vision. Or I might think of a melody, Beethoven's Ode to Joy, da 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 da. So I'm thinking of that melody, but I'm not hearing the actual notes of the music outside. So those are mind or processes taking sense objects as their objects.
Thank you.
Yeah, I said we would take a break now. I think according to the schedule, it's break time. So if